Why are values so incredibly important? What are your values? What are my values? And how do they influence what we do and what we accomplish in life? How are values structured inside of us internally, in our operating system, in the codes that make up our neurological networks? How are values related to attitudes? And how are attitudes related to beliefs? These are the structures of our consciousness. How is this related to our actions and to what we do in the world? What role do values play in our work and our helping other people? If we're in the role of social angels, how much are values important to everything that we do and to the ways that we can open up doors for other people? How are our values, beliefs, and attitudes encoded within everything that we do, hidden within our actions, and part of the underlying motivations and energy behind everything that we do? These are critically important questions, and we will discuss all of these during this video. I'm Honorable Dr. Joseph Randolph Bowers. I was named an honorary of the Australian Counselling Association for co-founding the counselling profession and the first international online open access research journal in our country. I've taught for over 20 years in the university sector, first in the field of health and counselling, and later in Indigenous studies and the education fields, developing numerous courses, programs, and degrees over the years, and finally coming back to my passion in community practice and in workplace development and training. Over the past 12 years, I devoted my work full-time to the field of specialist behavior support within the disability and mental health sectors, working with some of the most highly complex cases in Australia. Every one of those cases involves an individual, a real person who is dealing with enormous challenges and hurdles in life, obstacles and difficulty accessing services. It has been a great privilege and an honor to serve people in these situations, to offer them a type of service that they may never have had access to before during their lifetimes, in the areas of specialist counseling, psychotherapy, and behavior support practice. Even more so, and in addition to providing the insight, knowledge, skills, and practice opportunities to other people so that they can carry forward these principles and values, has been one of the greatest honors of my career and of my life. It has given my life a sense of purpose and meaning to provide other people the skills that they can take to carry forward these objectives, these beautiful and powerful ways of changing other people's lives by what we do and by who we are. One of the core secrets of every cultural and spiritual tradition is, in fact, how growth in values, attitudes, and beliefs encourage and nurture a way of being, a way of becoming. And this instills within us qualities of maturity, of giftedness, that is, the ways that we can give ourselves to others in more effective communication, more effective behavior, more effective social relationships. This changes the very dimensions of who we are, our identities in relationship with other people and with the environment. This is how we move forward with the major challenges of everyday life that we are facing as a humanity now on this planet. It comes back to you and me, to our choices on a daily, ongoing basis. How will we examine our values? How will we grow our attitudinal structures so that we can have an optimal way of being in the world? How will we reconstruct and build a new belief system that will make us more resilient, more aware, more able to function, more able to respond and to be responsible to the issues that arise in everyday life, in our relationships, and in our work with people as social angels. In our talk today, I have developed a very robust set of principles and very practical strategies. And so I would like to go through with you 5 major areas. This is going to be a jam-packed discussion. The information is so valuable and so exciting and so dynamic and important to our lives and how we construct our own sense of identities and how we can activate those identities to be functional in the world and to accomplish the goals and outcomes that we desire and that we dream of. This is the critical, most important information that anyone could possibly have. And to activate this is just at the core of everything. The first section we're going to go through a baker's dozen reasons why and how values are so central and important to everything that we do. We'll be looking at attitudes and beliefs and how these structures are formed within our neurological systems and how this activates within our behavior. We'll then be looking at the core conditions for counseling and psychotherapy, but really these are the core conditions for human communication. And when you grasp the centrality of this, the importance of these principles and of these practical skills is just mind-boggling. And how people could overlook this is even more astonishing. Then the third area we're going to look at the strengths of how this actually works in real life by sharing a very interesting story. The fourth area is going to look at core communication skills. And these are very exciting areas and vitally important for everything that we do in life. These are also the core communication skills used in the counseling and psychotherapy fields because they are so powerful, driven by research and decades of work, but also highly practical and on the edge in their terms of how we apply these in everyday life. Then we are going to look at core support skills for social angels. How do we work with people in everyday life? How do we work in behavior support? What are the core skills? And how can we activate these and move forward with these in complex situations? And finally, we're going to look at integral and holistic strategies and skills that give a kind of overview of the most profound dynamics and applications of all of these principles within a more holistic perspective. Values form the unconscious and sometimes conscious layers of our motivation and our behavior in everyday life. Values form the core, the underlying unconscious structures within our consciousness. And this core develops primarily over the first 7 years of our developmental cycle, from birth until age 7. Attitudes form around our values, and attitudes are, in another sense, the types of values that form over time into attitudinal structures. Attitudes grow from values. The attitudes that grow from values also develop over the first 7 years of our developmental cycle as human beings, from age 0 to age 7. And attitudes also continue to grow over the years, as do values. These structures form the core of our unconscious sensibilities, our very consciousness, and our identities as we grow in the human developmental cycles. Beliefs are structures that grow from attitudes, which grow from values. beliefs are a more conscious, but yet also a deeply unconscious part of our developmental capacities as human beings, because beliefs also form into unconscious habits of thought, habits of behavior. Beliefs growing from attitudes, growing from values, also emerges during the first 7 years of our developmental cycles. However, beliefs tend to be a more age-appropriate kind of developmental cycle, in the sense that beliefs emerge and change over the developmental periods. For example, the beliefs that we held as young children are not the beliefs that we hold as middle-aged children, are not the beliefs that we hold as older teenagers, are not the beliefs that we hold as young adults, are not the beliefs we hold as parents. When we have the experiential knowledge and wisdom of parenting, it changes everything, doesn't it? And when we're out into the work world and having new experiences of our dynamic relationships within the workplaces and within culture and society, our beliefs, attitudes, and values are informed in a reverse sort of cycle that influences our core sensibilities. And so our experiences in life feed back in a feedback loop back into the core of our value systems. It is rare, however, that adults will personally examine the structures of their unconscious. In this sense, the movements of personal growth and development in our contemporary world are often oriented towards engaging people in the skills, abilities, and capacities to self-examine belief structures, attitudinal structures, and value structures that exist within our consciousness, so that we have more conscious awareness, more ability to respond and to be responsible in our lives, and more capacity to function, more capacity to activate our behavioral changes and choices in a more conscious and generative way. It's said that beliefs are reinforced over time. And what we mean by this is that beliefs inform attitudinal structures which build on core values, which are temporal in the sense that they have developed since birth to age 7, and then through the developmental cycles of our aging as human beings over time. And so beliefs seem like they are really quite strong structures, robust structures, but in fact those beliefs have a basis within the organic and also neurological pathway development of our psyche, of our minds, of our emotional bodies, and the integral nature of how our emotional bodies interact within our physical sensibilities and our mental capacities. It's terribly ironic that people tend to be encoded with the belief about beliefs that beliefs cannot change. And this is just not true. From a psychotherapeutic and counseling perspective, beliefs absolutely can change and do change over time. We observe this over the developmental cycles. We know that a child does not have the same beliefs as an early adult, and that an early adult's beliefs change dramatically to middle-aged adulthood, and that our beliefs and attitudes and values also shift quite dramatically from middle-aged adulthood to elderly experiences of life. And that when we come to our experiences as self-reflective individuals, we can't help but to grow in our beliefs, our attitudes, and our values. That our new experiences cause us to self-reflect and to critique the beliefs that we have formed over the years through our experiences. And we come to realize that experience itself is primary. And yet there are obviously dominant approaches or or you would say themes that emerge over time that constitute a kind of core sense of values that endure, core sense of important ethics and principles that endure over time. And this is part of our developmental pattern as well, when we can recognize that there's a domain of surety, a foundation that we can build on that is giving us an optimal way of living, an optimal sense of behavior and ethics and interaction within the world, of responsibility. And there are a major sort of spectrum of areas that we are exploring all the time, and that these two domains of the dynamic of growth often overlap and interact and influence each other. Some of us are more on the edge of exploration, while others are kind of more stable in their approach to values, beliefs, and attitudes. And the key sense there is that we need to look at things more as a both and, as a paradox, because we need the exploration side of our lives and the adventure, as well as we need the foundational and the sense of stability that is existing within philosophies, values, and ethics that provide a kind of guideline or a sense of rule-based approaches to life and to behavior. Values then form the core, unconscious basis for our attitudinal and belief structures. In fact, values, because they are so deep and interwoven within us, form the motivational energy within the substructures of our being. In many ways, these form the meta-value system, the meta-system that operates the system behind the system. And in this sense, values are a very powerful place to be, to reflect and to engage. Values are the energy within the Mother Earth, for example, within the core of the Earth, the heat and compressed nature of the core of the Earth is very powerful, even though it is so highly contained. In the same way, our value structures within our consciousness form a very powerful core of our being that is like an engine that keeps our system running and functioning. Within these underlying structures, within this precognitive system, is what we call the presuppositions that orient the value system towards action, towards behavior, and that are integral to how our attitudinal structures and belief structures are activated over time. The presuppositions are the core sort of fingers of our value system that emerge out of the substructures of our conscious being, that activate directive energy towards actions, towards outcomes, and towards actual beliefs in the sense of conscious beliefs as they manifest in day-to-day life. Extending the metaphor then, if we can imagine that values are like our heart and our core of our being, attitudes then are like our arms, and beliefs are like our hands and our fingers that point towards action. And all of these systems work together to orient us towards action within the world. And we call this a sense of responsiveness, of capacity towards responsibility. Another obvious metaphor that people often use are computers and smartphones nowadays, and that the apps that run these systems are running the actual function, the fingers of the system, the behaviors of the system are run by meta-codes that are background operating systems, and these are run by the meta data that functions within those systems, and that these form the basis of electrical impulses and communications between various applications, which provide operating system that we can communicate with each other, even here on YouTube, and that this system itself is run by a sense of metacognition, artificial intelligence in that sense. When we become aware of what our unconscious beliefs, attitudes, and values, we can begin to articulate the actual presuppositions, the fingers of our value system that lead outward into the domains of action in everyday life. And those presuppositions are very powerful structures within our consciousness that we can become more aware of, and we can activate, and we can influence and change over time. In psychotherapy and counseling, we can observe an individual's presuppositional systems and how these function and operate, and we can work rather intentionally with these approaches to engage in a psychodynamic, very reflective, perhaps a narrative-based, but also an experiential and often transpersonal experiential training that engages in the individual's self-development and self-change, self-awareness. Utilizing the tools of neurolinguistic psychotherapy and clinical hypnotherapy, for example, we can work at the precognitive levels to reframe and reorient and redirect an individual's unconscious belief systems towards more generative outcomes. What most people assume then about these precognitive approaches to therapy is that we're not in control of these things as clients, and this just is not true. In fact, the methods of deep and profound psychotherapeutic change work are in the hands of the client, in the sense that the strategies and methods that we teach are enabled within the individual's awareness. And once they have that experience, they have learned literally an approach that they can use in everyday life that tends to accelerate in terms of how they apply that approach in dynamic ways with other types of issues, concerns, memories, experiences. This dynamically shifts their approach to life and accelerates their healing processes as well as their growth and potentials to activate and explore and to apply these principles in everyday life and experience. All values, attitudes, and beliefs are grown out of our developmental experiences and our learning over time. And the process is about how we apply meaning to, how we attach meaning to our fundamental experiences, which form the values, attitudes, and beliefs that define our sense of identity in the world. As we grow older, our developmental cycles emerge into a meaning-making approach, a meaning-making developmental cycle. The meaning-making developmental layers are where we become, at some level, conscious and unconsciously more astute, or more, unconsciously skilled at actually making meaning and realizing that we can shift our beliefs in a reverse action towards influencing our attitudes, so we can shift our attitudes towards shifting our underlying value systems, towards actually reorienting our motivational sensibility, which then erupts like a volcano to provide the energy that we need to sustain new and generative attitudes and beliefs in our behavioral manifestation. So this system goes this way, but it also goes this way. And once we have this more conscious awareness of how to work with our own inner being and with ourselves within the world, we get a really dynamic sensibility of what is this nature, what is this being human all about, what is this experience of exploring life in the body and in the mind and in the spirit and in the heart. That we are spirits having a human experience means that we can influence in a reverse way our beliefs, attitudes, and value systems that enable us to energetically transform our lives in new and exciting ways. Not only this, but our influence and control increases as we become more consciously aware of this cycle, and we can influence and help other people as social angels. And particularly when we're looking at concrete operational issues like behaviors of concern, we know that this awareness and skill and capacity is so central, so important, so vital, because this enables social angels, behavior support practitioners, therapists, social workers, doctors, nurses, this knowledge of how we become a living operating system of dynamic human potential, how this can be activated in our practice on a day-to-day basis, comes down to the concrete operational skills that we can manage, but also when we understand the inner dynamic and the social dynamic, even within our own beings, we have a secret skill and ability, a knowledge and awareness, a sense of maturity that emerges, a sense of generativity, a sense of altruism, which is the capacity to give of ourselves in authentic and meaningful ways, and so that we can emerge within our consciousness as authentic, as holistic individuals that provide value in the world where we work, where we live, where we share in everyday relationships. Conversely, when people operate within their unconscious beliefs, attitudes, and values, their behaviors are also, in a sense, driven by habits of thought and habits of behavior that can form ruts over time, that can become encoded with problematic issues, that can be bogged down by not having taken the time or having the opportunity to self-reflect and become more consciously aware of their values as core parts of their being, of how those attitudes have developed over time, based often on very traumatic or difficult experiences that are then interpreted in dysfunctional ways that form belief structures that are counterintuitive, that are difficult to engage because those belief structures are not optimal in a sense. They orient the individual towards mishappen experiences that make life more difficult rather than enabling them to become problem solvers and solution focused in their orientation to life and to relationships. When we find ourselves in behavioral ruts, it's usually because our actions have been largely unconscious, and we find ourselves in a situation of crisis that is extremely confusing because we don't really know, we're not aware of how it is that we got here in the first place. This is a really profound realization when I, in my own experience over the years, realized that I was in crisis situations and I didn't know why. I couldn't figure out how I got there. Then I started to track back. How did this happen? We often do this, in our processes. What caused this to happen? And then we look at blaming, or we look at finding causes of a situation which isn't actually all that effective either, because these approaches within our psychology often project the blame or project the cause onto other sources without actually realizing the underlying structures involved, the underlying patterns within our own attitudinal and value system and behavioral cycles, that the meta choices we make each day help to contribute to getting ourselves into or finding ourselves within a crisis scenario. Even when there are obviously aspects to every crisis that are part of our own internal set, but also part of the environmental set that happen from outside of us that are not necessarily involved in how we have made choices to create those situations, particularly when we look at structural issues within society where people have no access to, for example, modes of education or knowledge activities or access to services within the society. The individual hasn't chosen those layers of volition, but in the same sense, how we deal with those challenges and how we orient ourselves to those structures of society is also really important, because this gives us a sense of empowerment and of generative energy, that our values, attitudes, and beliefs can help us to deal with social pressures, prejudice, and or other types of social structures that may impinge on our liberty, impinge on our ability for choice and control. Generally speaking, then, the less conscious we are, the less choice and control we'll tend to have. The less conscious we are in our behavior, in our beliefs, in our attitudes, and in our values, the less conscious we are in all of these levels of our being, the less conscious choice and control we will have in day-to-day life. This influences our behavioral choices, which then further influences our participation within our relationships and within society. When we understand the practicality of this, we can intervene in quite practical and helpful ways, useful ways, that rather quickly change this dynamic and shift it up, that give us more choices, more ability to contribute to our behavioral manifestations in everyday life, in simple and everyday choices and ways that increase our sense of empowerment, our sense of activating behavioral choices that can free up our sense of beliefs, attitudes, and values. There is no doubt that while these conditions of being are universal, it's also so true that these beliefs, attitudes, and values have deeply important implications for professional practice, for the ways that we care for other people within our professional roles, and particularly when we're looking at positive behavior support approaches and methods that are based in a person-centered philosophy. It is extremely important that we engage in proactive beliefs, attitudes, and values that are based in an optimal framework. That is a framework that enables us to engage with professional practice that is non-discriminatory, that is very supportive, that is based in our capacity building to enable our optimal functionality as professionals within our roles, and to welcome and to support genuinely the people that we're working with who may not have the opportunities or the capacities to engage with this level of learning and of skill building. But in our roles, that is, particularly in our professional roles, we are, in a sense, expected to rise to the occasion, to learn these skills, to engage in self-reflective and critical self-reflective work, what we might call reflexivity, that engages with and enables us to actually reflect on our self-identity and our workplace identity, and to frame up our relational identity within a system of working that is not just for us, but we are there for other people. We're no longer just for ourselves in these roles. We are for other people. And getting things right is really important when we're in these roles. We have to upskill ourselves and learn and grow, and to enable ourselves to take on new skills and capacities. In this context, we introduced the idea of the core conditions of counseling and psychotherapy. And the core conditions of therapy are really a beautiful framework that is extremely powerful, that can be easily applied to many other fields of practice. In all social helping relationships, these core principles have sway. They are extremely important to consider. These core conditions were first articulated in the literature by a psychiatrist and medical doctor named Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, interestingly enough, championed what is called the person-centered tradition. He stood up within the medical and psychiatric profession of his day and said, we all need to stop. We need to reflect on what we're doing. We need to treat people in a different way. We need to literally shift our values, beliefs, and attitudes into a more personal approach to therapy and to psychotherapy. He championed what he came to understand as the core conditions. He didn't just pull these out of his hat, however. He engaged in research projects, and he observed human behavior in quite detailed ways, and over many years developed his framework. His person-centered framework has been incredibly powerful in terms of its influence over the psychotherapeutic field of practice right across the board. Rogerian principles, Rogerian approaches have influenced all forms of counseling and psychotherapy, and also within the allied health fields, and also within disability and mental health, and also across the fields of medicine. Person-centered methods is a phrase that everybody knows more or less, but not everybody may apply. And the champions of the Rogerian person-centered approach to counseling and psychotherapy tend to be counselors and psychotherapists, which isn't too much of a surprise. We have found in our work over the years that the Rogerian framework provides an incredibly strong foundation for therapeutic skill development as well as for interpersonal communications. And we have applied this principle, this framework, within business, within commerce, within social service organizations, and within social work contexts, and also within disabilities and mental health provision. In Australia, the person-centered approaches within disability services is a field unto itself in some respects, in the sense that when I entered into disability services as a field of practice well over 10 years ago now, I was quite surprised that person-centered approaches to disability care were talked about all the time, but without any acknowledgement of where the person-centered tradition actually grew from over the years. And of course, it goes back to the psychotherapeutic research that Carl Rogers instituted many decades ago, and now this has translated into other fields of practice where the people engaging in this approach may or may not know of the actual origins, and I think some of the depth and breadth of the teachings that were put forward within the person-centered tradition, and how important these really are. When we reflect on these, it renews our perspectives because it actually challenges our beliefs attitudes, and values. It brings us back to the core values that are most optimal within a field of practice, whatever that field of practice might be. We're working in disabilities, we're working in mental health, allied health, in medicine, in nursing. It doesn't matter what the actual application, the social application might be. It's that the core things that we are trying to accomplish through human intercommunications is really what this is all about. And I think that we have all been siloed into our individual professional ways of thinking, and the language and whatnot that we develop within our disciplines segregates us from other disciplines and makes a kind of an exclusivity within the professional domains of practice. And we see even in disabilities and mental health at the coalface, at the place where we are working hard every day in the trenches. This is really the place where those segregating attitudes really are not very helpful at all. We need to simplify things, don't we, in order to get to the core conditions of what we're on about and how we can actually accomplish this work in a much more positive sense. The first core condition that Rogers proposed is probably the most difficult to get our heads around. This was unconditional positive regard, and I would add acceptance. Unconditional positive regard is a fascinating framework to think about and to get your head around, but also to cue in from the head to the heart, because this core condition is also of the heart. And I think that's part of the reason why it is so challenging for a lot of people. Rogers' core conditions get to the heart of the matter because they demand, really. They encourage us, they nurture us, but they also demand that we deconstruct our intellectualization and that we get beyond it. He was all about the authentic, the genuine. He was all about the presence of two people communicating with each other. And how could that communication be clearer? How could it be less obstacles involved? How could that communication be more authentic, more genuine, more in the moment? Rogers' sense of unconditional positive regard was an application, perhaps, of an ancient principle in relation to faith, hope, and love even. That unconditional love in the Western Christian tradition is also a philosophical and a spiritual kind of principle. It is a framework. It is related to core conditions, that is, to beliefs, attitudes, and values that promote a virtuous life. Within the ancient tradition, the constructs of virtue are now understood in the secular world as related to systems of ethics and philosophies of practice. These systems of ethics and philosophy of practice provide the framework in which we can operate optimally. And that operation of our skills and abilities within the professional domains, within the secular world, is a way of also developing, in the older language, a virtuous approach, an approach that is more optimal, an approach that is more holistic. So the core condition of unconditional positive regard is a very challenging one in the sense that it asks us to take on the value of unconditionally, positively feeling, acting, and thinking towards other people who have radically different conceptions of human life and behavior. It doesn't mean that we necessarily need to agree with people of different expressions, but it does ask us to take an unconditional, positive framework towards other people that we're working with, towards all people that we're working with or that we live with day to day. These core conditions that Rogers proposed, I found, need to be applied as a personal construct, a personal value system, a personal belief system. When I learned these approaches initially, I thought, I don't know if I can really apply this within my existing philosophy of life. I had to question my own core beliefs, attitudes, and values and come to terms with what Rogers was proposing. For me to understand and take on his values that he was proposing, I needed to change my own. And I think this is part of the challenge that people undergo when they're taking on new professional roles. They need to understand that there is a level of this transformation that we go through where we even go beyond personal development and we transform ourselves. We transform our ways of working and our ways of being in the world. Can you personally take on a value, belief, and attitude that is unconditionally positive towards the people in your life? That is a profound question that each of us has to ask. Unconditional positive regard leads to acceptance. And acceptance is a powerful word because we're not talking about tolerance. We're not talking about patience or long suffering either in those more wider traditions of culture. We are talking about a sense of acceptance that is an unconditionally positive regard for another human being. And when we hold this, we also hold in abeyance our frustrations, our limitations, and in a sense, our humanity. We ask our humanity to rise to the occasion to unconditionally provide a level of regard, respect, of acceptance to another individual, regardless of how we feel about that individual at other levels. We provide a behavioral set, a behavioral approach, and a social demonstration of skills and abilities that actually convey unconditional positive regard and acceptance. This is quite a powerful and profound gift that we can give to other people. Related to unconditional positive regard and acceptance, Rogers next proposes what he called genuineness and congruence. Genuineness and congruence are core conditions of counseling and psychotherapy, he proposed, and therefore are core conditions of human communication. He observed and studied that when people are optimal in their relationships and in their mutual communications, that is, when communication is actually mutual, which often it is not, absolutely is not. Communication is often one-sided, as you well know. However, when communication is genuine, congruent, and exists within an unconditionally positive regard kind of environment, we're talking about environments here of nurturing, of encouraging, and of optimal growth and optimal understanding. So when these conditions exist, he observed that people were most genuine, most honest, most congruent. Congruence is a beautiful term because he was suggesting that when people are congruent, they are truly genuine. And when they're genuine, they are absolutely authentic. And authenticity is when our mind and our heart are in unison. When our thought processes and our communication and the words that we share are actually in tune with our emotional bodies, our sensibilities, and our values. That there's not a contradiction between our inner world and our outer world, our world of feeling and our world of inner value versus our world of communicated language and of our shared relationship with another person. Likewise, our relationships, when they are genuine and congruent, will sync together more easily. They will overlap and share with each other more honestly. Not to say that conflict is disallowed in this model. In fact, Rogers proposed these conditions to enable us to deal with conflict. He proposed these core conditions as a pathway towards resolution of communication breakdown and of settling disputes and of moving forward with positive approaches, with a sense of how we can agree, how we can compromise and agree and come to terms with our differences, to honor our differences with mutual respect, mutually positive regard that leads to greater genuineness, greater authenticity, greater honesty. And this leads to congruence within ourselves, within our core conditions of being, within our beliefs, attitudes, and values, but also within our relationships with other people in our world. The next core condition that Carl Rogers proposed was accurate empathic understanding. Accurate empathy is a really profound skill and a capacity, and when people demonstrate this skill, they tend to do so in spades. This capacity and skill entails not only an individual's ability to tune into what another person is thinking, feeling, and experiencing, but it is also the ability to demonstrate that understanding through feeding back to or communicating to the other individual what their understanding is of that person's thought processes, feelings, and experiences. To be able to tune in without bias, without prejudice, and without distortion is central to this concept of accurate empathy. Of course, there might well be various layers of inaccurate empathy where we might not quite get things right, or we might not have the ability in the moment to feed back the understanding that is accurate to the other person, so that our communication of our intuitive sense might be slightly off. In other words, the words we choose might not be on, but we might get part of what's happening. And the communication process then is a jostling back and forth of a sharing of mutual understandings towards gaining a greater accuracy, a greater sense of sharing what might actually be true in each person's case, and sharing that between two individuals. Accurate empathy is a profoundly moving skill because it gives us an innate sense that we're not alone, that we can share our reality with someone else, that they would tune into and understand where we're coming from, even if their experience of life is vastly different from our own, or if they're in a different age bracket, or a different cultural stance, or a different educational background, or a different cultural identity. When people communicate across these divides that you might think are fairly robust ways that people find obstacles in their communication, the skill of accurate empathy demonstrates how people find ways to communicate really genuinely in unconditional, positive regard ways that demonstrate how they share their sense of humanity and mutual understanding between people, even across vast distances and through barriers such as language or cultural understanding. Accurate empathy is a capacity to not only pick up on what an individual is thinking, feeling, and experiencing, but accurate empathy is also the ability to communicate and validate what the other person is going through at the moment and reflecting back to them in accurate ways how we understand their experience. The key components of accurate empathic understanding involve perception, understanding, validation, reflective listening, and empathic accuracy. These dimensions help us to understand that empathy is a process that we can learn over time. It is a communication skill as well as an inner capacity and a capability within an individual to open themselves up to understanding what other people are going through, to move beyond the ego identity of the individual to be able to pick up on what other people are experiencing in life. It would be great to go more deeply into these topics, but we don't have time in this video. But I just wanted to put a shout out to a range of theories and approaches that suggest how important accurate empathic understanding really is. Not only does Rogerian person-centered theory and practice have a lot to say about this area, but also attachment theory has a great deal to say about accurate empathy. And neuroscience and mirror neuron theory also suggests that individuals within our own neurological systems communicate with others, and that there is a mirror theory that our neurological systems mirror each other and respond to each other at this chemical and physical level, which is quite fascinating to consider. Likewise, cognitive behavioral therapy also has a great deal to say about the mishaps and obstacles that people encounter in their coming to terms with their own inner sense of meaning and also their cognitive capacities and ideas, but also how they convey that to other people, and the difficulties within that communicative process between individuals is studied a great deal in cognitive behavioral therapy. And of course, interpersonal psychotherapy and relationship models of therapy, particularly coming from Virginia Satir's approach to family systems, has an awful lot to also say about the existential and interpersonal dimensions that are involved in the communication process that influence our sense of empathy and that may hinder or promote an ability or capacity to pick up on what other people are going through. That is, our empathic capacity may increase when in the environment of relationships that nurture our sense of ourself, but also our sense of communicating with others, where that communication process is more oriented towards a positive feedback loop than towards a more negative and judgmental approach to communication. The next core condition that Rogers proposed is listening. Listening with an open heart and an open mind. Again, Rogers suggested that listening needs to be a whole of person approach, that it is a skill that is integral to and congruent with how we operate in the world. Not just as therapists, but these skills and abilities, as you can tell, these are core conditions for human communications. This means that these are also core conditions for our internal living with ourselves. Do we listen to ourselves? Do we really hear what we're thinking? Do we really hear and abide with what we're feeling? Do we acknowledge how we're feeling? Do we have a language to describe our feeling to ourselves internally or to someone else? Do we grow up learning an emotional language that enables us to articulate what we're feeling and the nuances of that feeling? Do we comprehend the depth of our feeling? Do we appreciate it? Do we acknowledge that? Do we allow ourselves to feel and to speak in a feeling language. Are these aspects or capacities or skills gender-based? Well, there is a gender component, obviously. These skills and abilities are, in a sense, transgender. They are beyond and above and transcend our notions of gender. They transcend age, they transcend culture, they transcend a range of values, beliefs, and attitudes. And really, they speak to core conditions of humanity, core conditions of what it means to be a Homo sapien within a family, within a tribe, within a nation, within a culture, within a spirituality that is embodied within all of these human relationships and within our environment, with nature, with Mother Earth. This is a universal skill set that we're talking about. And it is so necessary and important that both women and men growing up come to terms with how to listen, how to experience and understand empathy, how to be with another person in an unconditional regard, how to hold up these values as important and to demonstrate these skills in everyday life. This is critically important to our social well-being, but it also has so much to say about our individual sense of identity, our self-esteem, and our sense of purpose and what we can offer to the world. This is not about keeping a job. This is about being a good person. This is not about functionality and producing and performing. This is about being a good individual in the world who is able to convey a deep understanding and appreciation for what other people are going through, who thinks beyond their own needs and thinks about the considerations and concerns of other people. Giving of ourselves to others is a primary purpose of our being on this planet. I think if anyone is doubting themselves or is wondering why they're here, what is life about, just think about these core conditions, and the messages that they convey is that our lives are not for ourselves. Our lives are given to us for others. How we serve others says more about us than what we even think about ourselves. And to move beyond ourselves and our own issues and problems is a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful adventure, and it is core to our sense of what it means to be human. Over 31 years, I have dedicated myself on a day-to-day basis to practice these skills and abilities and to understand Roger's framework in practice has been an amazing adventure, and it has changed my life so dramatically. I cannot even begin to share all of the stories and insights that I have experienced to convey the depth of importance that these approaches to life have to offer. But I can suggest that there are additional core conditions that I have found to be very profoundly important. These include a sense of deep and profound curiosity and appreciation for the questioning nature that is part of our humanity. These also include a sense of nurturing our being, of embracing our reality, and of doing this in spite of enormous social challenges that would push against our doing this, our being present to ourselves, and actually being present and articulating with other people what they're going through and being with them through that. There's always a sense of pushback internally and socially towards really being genuine and congruent. I have found over the years that in some ways, for most people, it seems, that actually experiencing true, genuine love and acceptance is so much harder than experiencing rejection, judgment, and fear. And that the shadow aspects of humanity and the issues that we deal with and the hang-ups that we carry over the years influence our lack of capacity to take on these core conditions, to really grow in our sense of humanity. I've also sensed that basic empathy from a Rogerian point of view is also in need of transcendence. We need to grow beyond basic components of empathy to a more advanced empathic understanding that also includes an appreciation for intuition and for a deep psychic and emotive and contextual understanding that emerges in people that are gifted in these areas, that have developed their skills and abilities over many years, and that have, in a sense, transcended the basic levels of these skills that are articulated within the existing literature and within the therapeutic framework. I've also a sense that there is deep abiding connections and a cultural understanding that is critically important and really of central value also to these core conditions, and that the cultural and linguistic and meaningful ways that we relate to land, culture, to creation, to our country, to the sacredness of these things in our lives, and to our sense of ceremony and cultural practices also conveys so much depth, and that when we integrate these perspectives into therapy, it shifts the focus dramatically quite often for people, even quite mainstream people who have lost a sense of these cultural and spiritual traditions begin to reawaken to and to celebrate their own cultural and familial histories, and how important these values are or have been in their familial history, and how important this is in developing a nuanced sense of their own identity moving forward in life, and that these aspects of context, our relationships in this sense, deepen and soften and expand in their potential to allow us to develop these skills in a much more congruent way that speaks to who we are beyond our functionality and performance within society, beyond the stress and anxiety that we deal with in managing our role and our place in society. And that when we transcend these levels of stress and anxiety, we can do this much more readily when we practice the core conditions within a cultural and personally meaningful sense of spirituality, personal meaning frameworks that provide a context for our identity to flourish. Core communication skills involve active listening. Active listening is a form of listening that is really opening of ourselves to really be present to the other person as much as we possibly can. Active listening is a way of turning off the valve to our own thoughts for just a moment, to allow the thoughts of the other person to enter into our existence. Active listening waits in anticipation to hear, to understand, but also to be curious about what the other individual is about to say. And it's a way of not preempting our own thought processes and not thinking in our own minds what we're going to say in response while the other person is talking. To do this most effectively, I find you really need to give yourself pauses to slow down the process of communication in such a way that might be foreign to a lot of people in today's world. Slowing down the communication process starts internally when we're able to slow down our own cognitive process to the point where we can be quite intentional with both our thoughts and our words and actions. And this is a process of becoming more conscious, more aware. And to do this, it helps to become hyper aware, which is a contradiction in terms, I know. But when we look at the details and the space between the words and the body language, when we look at the inflections, hear the music of language, when we listen to it in more depth, when we see the eye movements of an individual, when we observe their lips and their musculature, when we look at the flushed aspect of their skin, when we look at their body language, how they're sitting or standing or moving as they're speaking, when we look at their gut and their sense of how do they hold their torso when they're communicating. Are they tensed up, for example? Are their muscles flexible? Are they kinesthetic in their own body awareness? Or are they more stuck in their heads, more intellectual, etc.? When you look at the details of how people express themselves, how they present themselves, you really begin to see that there is a language beyond language, a language beyond words. And this nonverbal language constitutes the vast majority of human communication. When you start to understand this and you start to study it, and I do mean study it, when you start to be aware of it at an intense level, you begin to understand the words are at a certain level. And they express certain truths, but also they hide often a lot more than they reveal. The more that you observe when you are listening, the more effective and in-depth listening becomes. You attune yourself to the other person, to their way of being in the world. You almost sink in to them in a kind of mystical way that is absolutely congruent between yourself and the other person. And the listening process becomes more of a communion, a kind of unity in being between yourself and the other being, the other person, where you're not so much individuals stuck in an isolated sensibility apart from each other, but you realize how our lives are interwoven and how we overlap, how we share energy fields with each other. And these fields incorporate the meanings that we convey and the meanings that we develop and construct and co-develop together in a creative process. This is part of a deeper form of listening that is incredibly therapeutic when you cue into this capacity and this skill and ability. It is a rare ability, I find, but it is attainable amongst people who are perceptive. Communication skills at the basic level include this sense of active listening that is a basic way of kind of trying to control your own mind so that you can have space inside of yourself to hear what the other person is saying to you in this moment. It's being present to them and allowing your own thoughts to just be there, to sort of float in the background if you can, and to quiet them just enough so that you can listen to what the other person is saying without thinking in your own mind what you're going to say next. Then when they communicate what they have said to you, you're thinking to yourself, do I get this? Do I understand what they're saying? And quickly working through that, but giving yourself a pause, a breath, or a moment, and thinking, how will I respond to this? And to help that out, sometimes you could even verbalize this internal process and say, hey, I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm trying to understand. I wonder if you could tell me more about that. Or I wonder if you could tell me more about this part of your story. What did that part of the story mean for you? These are good examples of open-ended questions that encourage not only the other person to share, but they also encourage our thought processes and they convey our curiosity and interest in learning about what the other person is sharing with us. So the communication at that level is multifaceted. And while the skill, the open-ended question, is a very simple skill in one sense, it's just asking a question that requires an open-ended answer, which could be anything that the individual wants to share with us. Like, how do you feel today? Can provide any kind of answer. And so there's that basicness of the skill, but then when it's in the context of our conversation, we're conveying our curiosity, our interest, our sense of empathic understanding. You could say something like, gee, I get what you're saying. I understand where you're coming from. I'm really curious about XYZ though. How does that work for you? So you see, you convey a sense of feedback, of meaning, and a sense of, I get where you're coming from, an empathic understanding, and you end with an open-ended question that invites the individual to share more with you. Another core communication skill is closed questions. Closed questions usually invite a yes or no or a specific answer. And closed questions are used a lot in situations where you kind of want to or need to focus the answers into a specific area or domain, and where you almost give a forced choice to the individual. Closed questioning is used a lot in the business field, particularly in sales, where you don't really want to open up an open-ended conversation because it would probably take too long. And you want to zero in on specific answers to specific questions. So an example of a closed question might be, do you prefer hot or cold? The individual will answer their preference, hot or cold. You might think of an example like, do you prefer soft clothing or clothing that's a bit coarse? A person might think about that and they might choose one or the other, or they might give you a third option, but the outcome would be fairly specific. Did you wake up early this morning? Invites a yes or a no. Do you like the movie that's out in the theater at the moment? And you probably would maybe suggest the name of the film, but closed question. What did you think of the film is obviously a very open-ended question, but did you like it or dislike it is a specific sort of question. It might invite more conversation, but you are asking a closed question. Feedback of meaning is the next skill that we'll discuss. Feedback of meaning is a really useful skill because it conveys immediately that you get where the other person is at, that you understand what they've shared. For example, you might say something like, I understand that you don't like roller skate and you prefer to go for a swim. So you fed back that you got what the person was saying to you, that they were sharing their preferences, their likes or dislikes, and you fed that back to them in a way that was pretty clear. Feedback of feeling is another type of skill, which is very similar, where you're saying, gee, I understand that you totally don't like roller skating and you feel really nervous being on the skates because you feel like you're going to fall down. But you would really prefer to go swimming because you enjoy the feeling of being in the water and the fun and excitement of throwing the ball around while you're in the pool. So there you fed back a pretty detailed description of both meaning and feeling, and you've gotten it pretty right. And you'll get an immediate sense from the other person if you're on the ball or not, because they will, just by their facial expression, will probably be smiling or whatever, responding while you're saying what is agreeable to them because it fits in their world, or they'll scrunch up their face, and they'll go, I don't think you got that quite right, just in their body language, or they might say something to you and say, well, not quite, like, I actually like roller skating. I don't know why you thought that, but I prefer to try roller skating because it's a new challenge for me. I'm just used to going to the pool every week. So your conversation evolves. So as you feed meaning between the two people, you come to a deeper understanding of each other. And the key there is that you feed back. There's always got to be a feedback loop. And that feedback loop in communication is the clarification. Clarification is everything in communication, because once we assume we understand what's going on, then you know what happens when you assume. It really does not work. There's always backfires and always mishaps when we make assumptions in our understanding. The key in all communication is clarification. The sixth and seventh core communication skills are basic empathy and advanced empathy, and we've already discussed those in a fair depth, so we won't cover them again in this context. Now, the next aspect we're going to look at are the core support skills. So these skills include, we've got 12 different skills listed here, and I want to go through these fairly quickly, and I might create a future video where we'll go in depth in these, but we don't need to do that today. Direct feedback is the first one. And direct feedback is a great skill because it is a way of providing both information, and it is a way of highlighting safety or risks or other types of information that need to be conveyed fairly quickly and directly. Direct feedback is a very important skill, particularly in fields like disability support and mental health. Redirection is another really important skill. Redirection is a way of reorienting another person to their behavioral projection, where that behavior might be going, to redirect them into a slightly different way forward. And that redirection can be for safety reasons. It can be for reasons of concern, where a behavior of concern is leading to a risk. Or it could be a redirection in terms of habits of thought or habits of behavior. It could be a redirection that might prevent an escalation from happening in behaviors of concern, etc. Another really important skill is direct guidance. Guidance is similar in a sense to redirection and providing direct feedback, but guidance is more of a counseling, quasi-mentoring kind of skill that both provides information but also encourages and nurtures an individual's strengths, skills, and abilities. Choice and control and or fixed choice and control, and offering these is another brilliant skill. This is often conveyed with open-ended or closed questions. And choice and control is a way of giving an individual a sense that they can actually choose within their environment, within their situation, different aspects that they can choose to do or to enjoy that is within their sense of choice and control. Reframing meaning is another really important skill. Reframing meaning is a way of turning around what an individual is saying in such a way that it might shift it from a negative to slightly positive. For example, if an individual is in a very negative mindset and is saying, I feel so miserable today, I am just really horrible. And you might say, I hear what you're saying, but I understand and feel how great you are, and you really were successful yesterday in doing X, Y, and Z, and maybe you could apply some of that good skill today. You're, in a sense, reframing the meaning that the person has conveyed in their sense of self-esteem in the moment by reminding them of a time when they were doing something that was successful and demonstrated a skill that they have. Reframing action choices is another great skill to offer. Reframing action choices is a way of offering the individual a different alternative action that they can participate in the moment. And so, for example, if they're going to throw an object across the room, you might hand them a ball to go outside and say, well, let's go outside and you can throw the ball around the yard with me. Pacing and leading is another great skill to consider. Pacing and leading is where we get ourselves in sync where the person is right now, and we even sync ourselves with an awareness of their breathing, the pace of their breathing, the pace of their verbal speaking, the pace of their body movements, and so we get ourselves in sync with them. And we do it in such a way that we're not mimicking them, but they have an immediate sense that we are really with them. We understand where they're at in the moment, and we're getting their body language, and we're mirroring their talk in some level, at some way. But it's really not a mimic, because mimicking becomes really kind of artificial and kind of scary and annoying, and mimicking can also feel like you're making fun of me. So we don't go there, but pacing is really an effective tool. For example, when I was working with many clients who were not interested in the counseling process, I would pace myself to be in a pretty laid back space, and I would literally get myself into a kind of, I don't really want to be here either. I kind of really get where you're coming from, and then slowly through that, you lead them to a different place or a different perception or a different sensibility. Pacing and leading is a really effective tool to use because it allows us to create congruence between ourselves and the other person, a connection. But it then leads the individual towards something that might be more generative, more useful, more helpful, more interesting, more fun, or just an alternative space from where they are at the moment. Physical and or environmental guidance is another specific area of skill that I find is very useful in disability and mental health work. And this is really related to guidance that is specific to physical dangers and physical possibilities and to environmental types of issues. And this could entail, for example, helping an individual to become safe within a traffic environment. This could be involving helping an individual navigate between the furniture in a crowded room or in a furniture shop. This could be engaging the individual with their environmental sensitivities or environmental issues. If, for example, you went into a shop where the perfume was heavy in the air and the individual you're working with had a type of sensitivity or allergy or a type of reactivity towards scents and or perfumes, you would quickly divert the individual and go to a different shop or a different environment. And these types of approaches and issues are where we gauge the environment, the safety and physicality of the world around the person we're helping and working with in relation to the person and their needs and sensitivities. And this is a very important skill that is beyond what are the traditional domains of skills within the therapeutic literature, because this is an active skill that involves our assessment of environments physical risks, physical sensitivities, physical dangers, and potentialities there that need to be considered and part of our planning when we're working with an individual in the community. Another core skill in support work is assessing safety and risk. This follows on what we've been talking about in terms of physical and environmental issues. But assessing safety and risk is an even wider field of practice. And I've found that even at the very basic levels of disability support and or mental health coaching, that safety and risk assessment is really an important component there. It is an aspect of what we call mental health first aid, absolutely. So that this is a capacity that you might take on in terms of understanding the basic levels of a person's mental health status and what is positive and what is negative within that for them, and how to support them within that would relate to understanding an individual's personal profile in light of their mental health disability and or other sensitivities or assessments that they have engaged in the past. So you would look at their therapeutic profile and you would look at their particular way of working and find out with the individual where their sensitivities are and how you can work best with that. And you develop a plan of action around that. And this is the way that you develop a safety and risk assessment planning process. Likewise, assessment of duty of care is another really important area to consider within core skills for support work. Duty of care is where we look at the risks and associated risks that are part of the profile of the individual that we're helping. And the duty of care is the sense that I have a responsibility for and with the individual to help to keep them safe. What is my duty of care? What duties do I have to assist the individual to stay safe, to engage in safe activities, and to reduce risks? Likewise, the concomitant or the skill that goes along with that is dignity of risk. The skill of assessing dignity of risk as compared to duty of care involves where is the boundary between risk versus the dignity of making a mistake or having risk or engaging with risk as a learning experience. Life is all about the balance between duty of care and dignity of risk. And finding the balance is the tricky part. Usually we rely on some kind of professional assessment process and or an educationalist perspective that looks at the person's developmental capacities and where they are at in the moment, at the present time. And those assessments provide a framework from which you can develop a plan around dignity of risk and duty of care. The last is providing choice and control, which we've already discussed, and choice and control is a very specific skill that is important within the disability and mental health field of practice. And in mental health recovery spaces, an individual needs to feel empowered to make choices and to have a greater sense of control over time in their life and in their health. And these are important considerations to integrate within your approaches. Integral and holistic support strategies are the last area that we're going to cover today. This involves learning that behavior support is a holistic method of supporting people in everyday life. The implementation of behavior support principles involve actually keying into the motivational strengths of an individual and working with them in a positive way that is non-punitive and non-judgmental, and that works to support the individual with genuineness and congruence, unconditional positive regard, and many of the strengths and qualities that we've been discussing during our talk today. Holistic person-centered principles and practices are central to this approach and method. Likewise, the comprehension of personal dispositions, interests, and strengths is really important to understand. I can't emphasize this enough, and I can also say that over the years, whenever I have tended to ask, do you understand what the person's strengths are? Or what are your child's major strengths and interests? Or what are the individual's strengths? And how would you describe their personality in terms of positive aspects or skills that they might have? Often people that I work with struggle to answer these questions. It makes me very curious about how human beings tend to focus on the negative, even in our relationships of support, and even when we're in the role of social angels and we're caring for and helping another individual. Sometimes we're so focused on what has to be done, what needs to be done, and all of the safety and risks involved that we lose sight of how beautiful it is to be together, how beautiful it is to have strengths and abilities, capacities and interests, and to be able to focus some time and energy on that is really an important consideration. Understanding the ecological scenario that exists within and around the person is really an important aspect of positive behavior support as well. And this involves understanding the close, near relationships the individual has, the more extended community experience that the individual lives within, the wider social net and situation that exists around the individual, and then the socially wide situation that exists within the culture and society at large. And these four spheres of influence, or these ecological systems, exist around the individual, and they interact with the individual, and understanding the relationships at those different levels and how they interact and influence and or hinder and or support the individual are really important aspects to understand within our supporting an individual one-on-one, because every relationship exists within a context and no behavior exists outside of relationships. Deployment of lifestyle health or lifestyle medicine approaches and methods within support systems is becoming a much more widely known and practiced skill and ability. And at the basic levels, this incorporates a sense of healthy eating, a healthy lifestyle balance with work and or other interests in life, a healthy sense of exercise, of engagement in the environment and getting out, getting some fresh air each day, a sense of going for a walk every now and then, and building these basic levels into our support of individuals within disability and mental health support systems. This is a lifestyle planning approach that has existed for a long time in disability care settings, and that's for sure. But incorporating a more healthful approach to this incorporates the guidelines, or the more current and contemporary guidelines of the healthcare sectors and the health system in general and public health, to incorporate aspects of lifestyle health and lifestyle medicine principles within our daily support approaches. Following on the work of the United Nations and their perspectives on the rights of people with disabilities, and also within the mental health and allied health fields of practice, the human rights of individuals incorporates a sense of our looking at intentionally quality of life measures and standard of living measures, and how does the individual situation stack up when looking at these various measures, and incorporating this in a basic support approach and planning method is really a useful way of thinking, because when we look at standards of living and quality of life measures, we key into the person's interests and their strengths and abilities, but also their vulnerabilities and their needs for support, and how we can build in strengths where they have existing weaknesses within the support system that exists around that individual, and where we can compensate for their particular vulnerabilities, risks, and or their ways that they need support. Likewise, there is a holistic and comprehensive risk assessment approach that is being advocated currently, particularly in the disability sectors in Australia and in the mental health and allied health areas, where a comprehensive risk assessment is becoming essential and has followed on from risks that have been identified throughout the COVID-19 pandemic over the past several years, and is a forward-looking approach to examine the nature of risks within an individual's life and how can we build in support and mitigation strategies that could address those risks to reduce the risks where possible, and build in a plan to build more strength and resilience into an individual's life and the support planning and processes around that individual.